I'm very uh, moved to introduce Deacon Dr. Paul Siewers today, who who agreed to be with us despite the fact that it's also the end of his teaching term right now. And in this class, we've been meeting various people from the Russian Church abroad, of the Russian background, and I've been asking them the same question. Uh, the same question: uh, How did they discover Russia? Because they were born outside of Russia. Today, it's a different meeting because I believe our objective is to always to put ourselves in shoes of the other. Because sometimes we just sort of take things for granted. We don't bother to extend ourselves to another person, whoever this person might be, try to understand him, how things look from his perspective. Like if we'll deal with the children is a little human, so he sees everything from the like small distance. So that's his world, sort of things like that. So without further ado, I would like to ask Father Paul to give us his academic background, what you've been doing, Father, as an academic, because he has like dual identity. He's a deacon. He set up a community of the Russian Church abroad in the central Pennsylvania, but at the same time, he is a well-established academic. Would you mind telling us about this persona of yours?
Yes, and thank you so much, Father, for inviting me here. It's a real blessing and a privilege to be here. Um, and it's also especially a joy because you were my instructor in the pastoral school. And I know you may not remember this, but you encouraged me to think about becoming a deacon
Oh, no.
some years ago. So not to blame you or make you responsible for my unworthy diaconate here, but anyway, I thank you, and the classes that I took with you on history were very influential on me in terms of thinking about history and the Orthodox Church, and very helpful as a convert, especially, but as an academic as well. So
You're very kind.
yes.
You're too kind, Father.
Well, glory to God. It's true. And I have a PhD in English, which in American academia means literature now mainly. But my area of study in my PhD and since is mainly in early literature, pre-modern literature, especially medieval literature, and connections between early literature in the West, in Latin and the vernacular languages, and also the Church Fathers and the writings of the Desert Fathers and so forth. And because I teach at a school that's a liberal arts university, and we're a rather small university, we're not a research university, but I also teach on more modern literature, and I've also gotten to write a little bit more about modern literature as well. I have a master's degree in journalism, and worked for about a dozen years as a newspaper reporter in Chicago. So I also have an interest in what academically I call public rhetoric, and the way in which public discourse functions in the media and in public life, particularly in America. I have another master's degree, as my wife says, I'm a perpetual student in history, and my undergraduate degree was in history as well. The medieval studies work that I did as a doctoral student was in literature, but medieval studies tends to have a heavy history component as well. So while I'm not a historian at all, I do have that background, and I appreciate, again, so much the work that Father Andre, you're doing in history from my little perspective there. So that's that kind of sums up, I think, my academic background. My work is currently I'm working on some projects that relate to literature and Christianity, and trying to see some parallels between um, Western literature and Russian literature, the latter especially in terms of Dostoevsky, but looking for some common themes of Christian concerns in American and English and Russian literature. So that's what I'm working on currently. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Father Paul. So if that, then we can just start on our presentation, right?
Right. Yeah, that's fine. And if it's, I apologize if it's noisy here. If you have difficulty hearing me, let me know and I can move. I have a group of baby birds in a birdhouse that are directly above me here, and they're chirping away. And then the landscapers tend to come out whenever I'm here trying to talk on Zoom. So anyway, but just one quick thing in the background, you can't really see it, is the Susquehanna River. It's the West Branch, but of course it's part of the same river system that starts up by Jordanville. So if anybody wants to send a paper boat down the river, I may get the message here in a day or two. But anyway, so that's good. So Father, would you just like me to talk a little bit about my experience coming into the Russian church and with missions, our mission here, or
right.
I have overall comments too.
Yes, yeah. I kind of thought that it's going to be a preview of your papers that you will be, God willing, presenting at our conference in November. So therefore, whatever you have to say regarding along the lines of my introduction, so basically to understand perspective a person who wasn't born Russian Orthodox, who joined this community. How does this look? What is this experience? So can you unpack it? Can you describe it?
Yes, yeah, no, real good. And just for my reference here, about how much time do we have? I should have asked you that before, but just like
yeah. Thanks for bringing this up. Right, this is a 2-hour unit, and we will be having a break at 9:50. Yes, at 9:50.
Okay. 9:50. All right, great.
Having a full-blown break. So, and it also depends on your time and your on your situation.
Sure. And I want to, if it's okay, I want to leave time, of course, for your questions and conversation, and Father or others, please feel free to kind of break in as I'm talking here, if you have questions.
Very good. That's very Russian. I'm already cutting you. You see, that's well, that goes naturally. So about cutting, interrupting, I am all very good at this. All right, Father.
So I was thinking in preparing for this of a few big questions that I think are involved in this topic, and maybe I'll just mention those big questions, and then I'll talk a bit about my experience and some models that may or may not be helpful. But one big question is, what does it mean to be American in the Russian church? And with, asking forgiveness for the Canadian here, but what does it mean to be North American in the Russian church? And to what extent is Russian Orthodoxy distinct in its position in evangelizing America? So, when we talk about the Russian church, of course, we talk about a church that has a long, long history with connections to the Russian people and the Russian nation across centuries, but it also sort of has a meaning. It's a little bit like the term Roman Catholicism. If we're talking about Roman Catholicism, we don't mean everybody is Roman who is Roman Catholic in the United States, right? You can be Irish Catholic, Italian Catholic, or whatever. And I think there's an aspect of Russian Orthodoxy that's like that it stands for a certain kind of religious culture. Of course, Orthodoxy is the umbrella term, but so to what extent is Russian Orthodoxy distinct in evangelizing America today? What does ROCOR stand for today? Not the acronym, but the church itself, right? After the fall of communism and its reunification with the Moscow Patriarchate. And also, how does that relate to connotations of Russian in America? There's a long history of, I think, if you go back into history of somewhat friendly and positive relations between Russia and America, but then, of course, the Cold War and communism, and then most recently, Russiagate and so forth. There are sort of negative connotations of Russian in popular American culture as well. There's also, I think, and again, I'm just going through a few big questions here at the start. There's sort of an issue of liberal versus traditional Christianity, which seems to be important in American religious culture at large. And I think within Orthodoxy in America, I've heard discussions in recent years of, will there be some kind of reorientations within jurisdictions and so forth in terms of what is traditional Orthodoxy versus maybe what is more religiously liberal Orthodoxy, however those things are defined. So there are some questions about that, and where does ROCOR, the Russian church, where does it fit on that spectrum, if it fits anywhere on that spectrum of American religious concerns. Two more big questions just to have in the background. Is diaspora a relevant term to American evangelism? So when we talk about the Russian diaspora, how does that relate or not? Is that a term that has relevance to evangelizing America from an Orthodox standpoint today? You have many different ethnic groups that are Orthodox within American culture, non-Orthodox American culture. You have many different ethnic and cultural backgrounds that often underlie people's attitudes, whether it's, Scots Irish or Asian American, African American, different kinds of perspectives. So how relevant is the idea of a diaspora in terms of American Orthodoxy today, especially when Orthodoxy now, although it's a very small minority, has been around for a while in the American scene. And finally, how are we faithful to the Orthodox faith as strangers in a strange land, whether we are of Russian background or Anglo-American background or whatever? Our sojourn on earth is a limited time, and the Bible, in a sense, describes us as strangers in a strange land, outcast from paradise, wherever we are. I think there's a theme of exile in modern life that encompasses a sort of alienation of human beings, regardless of people's status, nationally or immigration-wise, and how do we relate to that? So those are some big questions. I don't think there are going to be any answers today. Sorry, but I'll try to address some of those from my own experience. Just to give you a little bit of background on my experience, and then maybe I'll pivot to talking about a few models that may or may not be helpful, in thinking about this, that came to my mind as I was looking through some articles about Orthodox converts in America. In my own experience, so I'm now a deacon at a ROCOR mission in central Pennsylvania. We are in northern Appalachia here, and that's a distinctive region in the United States. There's sometimes central Pennsylvania is called Pennsyltucky, which is a sort of derogatory term, meaning that it's like Kentucky, only it's in Pennsylvania, Pennsyltucky. So, but I think some of the locals embrace that, because they sort of like being, in the hill country and Appalachia and so forth. We're actually in a valley right here, but there are hills around us. So, for example, we've gotten 6 acres of land, and we're working on building a mission. But some of our members have kicked around the idea of why not have an Orthodox bluegrass festival on our land, where we would have some gospel music and, things like that. And I don't know that that's ever going to happen. Maybe it's not appropriate, but there's been discussion of that. And that's an example of how you can have seemingly weird combinations of, ROCOR, this idea of some kind of Orthodox bluegrass festival as an outreach activity for the area and so forth. So, it's a little bit like at Holy Cross Monastery in West Virginia. There's a troparion for Pascha, I think, that's sort of adapted from Appalachian music, right? Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and that's a musical theme from Appalachia that, has been used as a Pascha troparion. So these are the kinds of things that happen. My own experience in my own life, I talked about recently in a blog post, because I was married to my wife, who is Russian, on the Sunday of the Myrrh-bearing women. So this past Sunday, although our anniversary date is later this week now. But at the time that we were married, I had been baptized Orthodox only a few years, and we were married in the OCA church, or the OCA Cathedral in downtown Chicago, or near downtown Chicago, Holy Trinity Cathedral, which was one of 3 cathedrals built partly with funds from Tsar Martyr Nicholas II. And it was designed by Louis Sullivan, who was a famous Chicago architect. And at the time, I had been writing about Chicago history and architecture for the newspaper where I worked. So there was this kind of meld of Chicago history, this very traditional looking Orthodox cathedral, and the wedding, which was, this beautiful Orthodox wedding, glory to God, with all the iconography, the going around with the priest and circle and the crowning and everything. And my relatives there who were not Orthodox were just kind of overwhelmed. I think they may have thought it was partly strange, but they thought it, it was very beautiful, but it was a real different cultural encounter. But my background was I was raised a Unitarian by parents who were, I think, very morally concerned people, but not religious. So I didn't really read the Bible at all until getting into 8th grade in high school. I was raised Unitarian, and then my mother's family were mainly Christian Scientists. So I was a member of the Christian Science Church for a while. Both of those are very sort of New England-y background religions, like from the 1800s in America. And the Christian Scientists I describe as Mormons without medicine. So it's kind of a Gnostic cult, but, a lot of nice people, like my experience with Mormons, they, often tend to be very concerned about values and interested in the Bible and so forth. But it was, very different from Orthodoxy and had that sort of Yankee background. But I also have a lot of Irish background. And when I was in graduate school, I started reading Dostoevsky on the side. And I also was studying the early Irish church a lot. And I was very interested in the early Irish church, its traditions of monasticism, how Christianity spread in early Ireland through the social networks there. And I kept finding references fairly regularly to the Desert Fathers, to Greek church fathers, their writings that were influential in early Ireland. And that led me around to the Orthodox Church. So it was a combination of, kind of the emotional side of reading Dostoevsky and the intellectual side of studying the early Irish church that helped lead me to Orthodoxy. And then I started going to a Greek church that had a lot of converts in our university town in Illinois. And there was just struck by the beauty of the liturgy. And then several years after that was baptized, married my wife, and so forth, as I described earlier. So that in outline, was my experience with Orthodoxy. I think being able to visit a monastery fairly regularly during that time was very important to me. And I would say if there are any sort of lessons from my experience, I think even more than any outright evangelism going on, because there wasn't a lot of outright evangelism by Orthodox Christians that I encountered, but even more important than that, was just being able to go to services, being encouraged by people at the church, and then experiencing the monastery and the example of the lives of the monks and their guidance. Those were all really important to getting me into Orthodoxy. And when I got into Orthodoxy, as I was getting into Orthodoxy, I became aware of ROCOR. I was in the Greek church, but the monks who I got to know were, they were Greek, but they were kind of ROCOR friendly. And they suggested, well, why don't you also go to the ROCOR church? So when I was up in Chicago, I would go out to the cathedral in Des Plaines. And at that time, there was a small English parish meeting in the basement of the rectory where Bishop Alippi, I believe, was at the time. This was some years back. And that English community, English speaking community, later spun out to become a mission west of Chicago. So I think finding an English language community and other converts was, also helpful to me. But to me, I think the Russian church, as I was joining it, was not so strange as it might seem, because I was also familiar as a teenager and in college with the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And I had been involved in college with an Amnesty International group, and we would write letters on behalf of political prisoners. And many times at that time in history, which was the end of Jimmy Carter's administration, there was a big human rights emphasis in US foreign policy under President Carter that was directed at different regimes. But many of the letters we would write would be on behalf of Soviet dissidents, at that time. And so I was kind of aware of the kind of suffering that many in the Russian church had endured for their faith, in the 20th century. And I think that really served as an example to me and something that made me feel very sympathetic to the Russian faith, to Russian Orthodoxy. So I think, just to maybe sum up here, that there are a few areas of overlap, despite the great differences between Russian culture and faith experience and American experience. There are a few areas of overlap. I think one is, at least in my generation growing up, there was a certain amount of sense of anti-communism and concerns with communism, and the experience of ROCOR in relation to that. There was a bit of an overlap there. I think there was, as different as American culture is, there was a strong sense of a kind of civic or civil Protestant religion in the United States. That was, a background, I think, to my conversion in part, even though that was very shallow in a lot of ways. It was still made me sympathetic or engaged with Christianity on some level. And I think that it may sound weird, but there's certain, I don't mean to say political considerations that overlap, because I don't think the political considerations are so important. But I think there are certain structures about American society, at least in the past, such as the Constitution, which, in a very odd way, despite all the surface differences, there's a little bit of an overlap with certain traditional Russian ideas about monarchy and order. That may sound very strange. I can explain that more if people have questions about that. But the fact that among democratic countries with constitutional governments, the United States probably is the strongest, executive, and the president. And the way that the Constitution is sort of set up almost as this kind of, a little bit of a transcendent order. Weirdly, this is a kind of pet theory of mine, which again may be strange, but I think there's a way in which that can overlap with some of the monarchical backgrounds of ROCOR. Again, that's not a reason to convert, but that's a kind of perhaps strange cultural connection. But I think most of all, the witness of ROCOR today, while I think starting with myself, speaking for myself and my immediate community, we can do a lot more in terms of evangelism among Americans, and we need to, God willing. At the same time, I think some of the things that ROCOR and experience of Americans in the Russian church involve are appealing to potential American converts. I think the emphasis on liturgics and tradition and the sense of a witness to the faith in a traditional way. This can get tangled up with American politics and culture in a negative way, perhaps, but I think in many ways it's a potential positive for evangelism work in the future. And I think that the number of, in my immediate experience here, we have a few churches in our region that are very small but have seen an uptick in converts coming in. Part of that was during the pandemic period, people who were looking for what they felt was a little more of a traditional jurisdiction within Orthodoxy, some people who are new in Orthodoxy. But I think there are also a fair number of ROCOR clergy who are converts, increasing use of English in liturgies in ROCOR parishes. And so I think while the number of ROCOR adherents is small, according to the recent survey of Orthodox jurisdictions, I think that it's important to know that, but I think it's also maybe not telling the whole story about the potential for evangelism and what's going on. And I suspect there may be a little bit of an undercount there, because as I recall, I need to double check this, but I don't think our mission responded to that survey when we got the information from it. So, we didn't. So there may be a little bit of an undercount, but more important than that, I think there's some reasons.
Right. Alexei Krindich from Patriarch Athenagoras Institute, he said that he received, and I was very surprised by this, he said that and he's the person who conducted this poll that you mentioned, and he said that he received responses from all ROCOR parishes, which is for me totally, how to say, extraordinary, because knowing how things operate, to receive responses from all communities is completely outstanding.
Yeah, well, that's good to know. Missions like ours, while we're a parish, we might not be somehow on the list of what he had.
You should be. Yes, you should be on the list, despite regardless. Yes, this is just a footnote, Father. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So, but just to wrap up these beginning comments, I think there's a lot of good potential for outreach. I think there is a lot of outreach going on. I think we can and should, speaking for myself, think further about how to do that in the current American situation. But I think there is a place for the Russian church, and I think there's a kind of level of meaningfulness for Russian Orthodoxy in North America that can contribute to evangelizing North America for Orthodoxy. I just think that we're in a kind of transition period, partly here, where we're kind of moving between generations, between eras, still adjusting to the situation of the reunion with the Moscow Patriarchate and relationships with other jurisdictions. Even though that occurred a while back, it's in the whole history of the church, it's just been a kind of blink of the eye. And even American history itself is a blink of the eye, if you're looking at a larger sense of time here. So, we just have to continue to pray and work, and maybe become a little more aware of both the stories of converts and the stories of people who grow up in the Russian milieu, and how we can have that Venn diagram between the two to strengthen our outreach to America at large. So those are a few thoughts.
Thank you, Father Paul. So, right, it's interesting that you mentioned our reconciliation, right? That it's still somehow it is still something that we are processing. If I understood you, can you maybe a little bit explain more what was your thought about?
Yeah, I think that and Father Andre, I think that I've heard you discuss this in very thoughtful ways. I think before, maybe on your on videos and so forth, as I recall. But I think it raises questions about what is the role of ROCOR today. If ROCOR originally was an exile church in effect that was trying to keep the Russian Orthodox Church alive during the time of communism in an exile situation where there were questions about, obviously it was continuing within Russia, but there were questions about, well, first of all, just, a lot of persecution and then also about the degree to which there might be state control, or there were just questions about, big questions about what was going on within Russia. But then when communism ended and there was this reconciliation, then there's the question of, okay, what does the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia stand for today? What is its role today? What is its purpose? Is there a purpose to it? I would say that there is, and I would say that it relates to a lot of the secularism with which the modern West struggles today. I think we're in a period, some people have described it as a post-Christian period in the West, maybe globally and among developed nations generally, but especially in the West, Western Europe, and increasingly in North America. And I think that the tradition of the Russian Church as reflected and distilled in ROCOR as part of the Russian Church has a lot of experience and a lot of background in trying to adapt and cope with secularism, with Western situations, and suffering of the church. And I think there's a lot there to offer people in America. I think that there's I spoke earlier about the problems and the benefits of in dealing with what have been called culture wars in America, between which have mainly been between Protestants, conservative Protestants and Catholics, and people have been more liberal over the last few generations. And sometimes this is called culture wars over issues such as marriage and abortion and so forth. Those are issues that converts can bring with them into the Russian Church, and there can be negatives with that. But I also think, to flip it around, converts can sometimes have an understanding of American culture and what's going on in American society that may be different, and in some ways less insightful, some ways more insightful than perhaps people who grow up in a Russian milieu or are from Russia. And so I think that, having some dialogue and realization of that, yes, there can be problems with that, but there also may be some understandings of things that are happening within American society and ways in which Orthodoxy can address those issues and appeal to people who are troubled by things like, the expansion of transgenderism as a kind of cultural outlook, or the expansion of a more generally atheistic or materialistic view. I think in the United States, I try to recognize this more and more, that um, orthodoxy does not involve a certain political view. You know, there's no salvation in any political party here. And in fact, I think an Orthodox Christian view of social and cultural issues, such as the statement by the Russian church in the early 2000s on the concept of society, it doesn't really align up nicely with conservative or liberal in American politics. But I do think there are issues about Christian tradition that people genuinely need in our society today, that they need to engage with. One thing with our students in college, you know, that I've heard from counselors, and I've seen this myself, there's such an extreme sense of loneliness often in American culture and society today. And I think Orthodox Christianity offers an antidote to that, as well as, of course, a deeper sense of salvation. There's more to Orthodoxy than just an antidote to loneliness. But I think offering people a deeper sense of Christian faith and a deeper sense of Christian community. And I think there are just a lot of people, you know, myself included in the past, and I still struggle in my spiritual life, but there are a lot of people who are just struggling in our very materialistic culture. And it doesn't mean that you're liberal or conservative. I think both sides of the equation are very affected by consumerism and materialism. And really, you know, Orthodoxy offers a wonderful way to help and reach people the way, really, through our Lord. And I think the Russian church is part of that outreach. You know, it offers a really rich tradition in many ways, including cultural and literary. You know, like I mentioned about Dostoevsky being, you know, a factor in my becoming Orthodox. You know, and so I think we need to think of ways to reach people on different levels. You know, having missions, having enough clergy. We seem to have a shortage of clergy, at least in Pennsylvania, which is a historically Orthodox area, and also educationally in educational institutions. You know, how can we have people present in them, as difficult as that can be sometimes because they become much more secular, but have, you know, Orthodox professors, Orthodox graduate students, you know, strong Orthodox communities and educational institutions, presence in media, all these things. And so it's something for us to be thinking about in the Russian church, as other jurisdictions have been thinking about that too.
Thank you, Father. I remember a priest in the greater Boston area was telling me that when he encounters potential converts or seekers who would like to join the church, and they would explain to him how they were scandalized with this or that aspect of their contemporary church, he said, I mean, to the effect, it was a while ago, 2009, this conversation, but to the effect, he said, don't join because you are going to bring your war here. If you are joining the church because you are fed up with ABC list, in while you will discover something that you will be scandalized here, and it will put you off. So that was something that I remember, and I just think sometimes that we can be more appreciative of what we have here in this country. For instance, like our monastery in Jordanville is also a part of American narrative. And Vladika Averki, he was able to criticize vices of the society precisely because he was defended by the freedom of speech guaranteed in this society. And we kind of take it for granted, and we sometimes don't realize how it can be difficult to speak our mind elsewhere.
Yeah, well, I think those are great points, Father. And I think that I know that when I was coming into Orthodoxy, I kind of had reached the point personally where I felt that I just needed the Christian faith to survive. You know, it was sort of life for me, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that time, you know, whatever, and I'm not holding myself up as an example here, I'm, you know, most unworthy, but at that time, the cultural and the political things were like insignificant to finding Christ in Orthodox Christianity. So definitely, I think those things can be a baggage. I think that there are elements of American society today that I think are working against free speech to some extent, you know, and what you said about those kinds of freedoms. And they're doing so in the name of ideologies, and that can come on the extremes of either side, you know, of politics too. And I think that's something, you know, we need to have a concern about as well. I was going to mention a few, just briefly, if it's okay. I know you're coming up on break here, but maybe, you know, if we have a few minutes before 9:50, I was just going to mention a couple models that, you know, had occurred to me for thinking about conversion and evangelism and the issue of Russian, you know, being an American convert to Russian Orthodoxy. One was the early Irish model. Of course, that's very ancient now, but you had evangelists coming into Ireland who were using Latin as their principal language, right? And they were able to embed themselves in Irish social networks, the extended families, the clans, and monasteries were very powerful, it seems, from what we know historically in that process, that they formed monastic communities and lay communities of faithful formed sort of around those or related to those monastic communities. And while that's an ancient model in a different country, but I still think we could be doing more in Orthodoxy generally around America with monastic presence. And I think even within the Russian church, where we have some excellent examples with Jordanville, Holy Cross, probably others I'm not thinking of right now. I know Abbot Trifon's monastery up in Washington State and so forth. We could be doing more with that, and I think we should be thinking about that, because I think there are efforts like Ancient Faith Radio, which is mainly through the Antiochian Church, which I think reaches a lot of people through media. But I think there's also that other level of monastic communities as more of an anchor for Orthodoxy and Orthodox outreach. Certainly in my life, that was very important. The opportunity to visit a monastery regularly when I was becoming Orthodox was really important to me. So I know we're coming up on the break here. You may have other things to do after the break, but so just let me know. I can either stay or leave or whatever is good at this point for you.
No, definitely. I kind of monopolized the floor, so I would like to give students opportunity to ask their questions. At the same time, I also would like to mind their time, their break time. So I think if we can stop at this point, and if you have time more to speak to us, resume at 10 o'clock.
Sure, very good.
Thank you. Thank you.
That'd be great. Thanks so much.
Yes, we'll see you soon.
Yeah. Okay.
So, Father, we are back to our second hour, and I would like to invite students to reflect upon Father Paul's presentation, maybe to share your thoughts, ask questions, please.
Okay, I can start. First of all, thank you very much, Father Paul, for your for sharing your experience, for your wonderful lecture, and for giving some fruit of thought and being, being inspired to reflect on these events. So thank you. I would ask a threefold question. In my understanding, usually the ROCOR parishes here in the United States is some sort of a center of Russian presence, of Russian culture here in the United States. So I would ask you, as an outsider, or as an American, when you were, I would ask you about your experience when you, encountered this Russian presence and Russian culture that is there. So what would you name as something positive in a Russian culture, something that an American person is sympathetic to? The second, I would ask you if there was something alien to you, which at some point you found important and valuable, and what is something in this Russian cultural code that you would say is repellent to an American person?
Yeah, just a sec. I'm not sure if cultural code is something because it's a Russian expression, but does this come across as the English one, cultural code? Yes, is it something we hear? Cultural code. I mean, in Russian we used it in the sense that it's a set of cultural markers that form a person. Like, for instance, in the US, that would be cartoons. Everyone saw the same cartoons. I didn't grow up in US, so I'm missing it. But therefore, there is like Soviet movies that is part of my cultural code. Just to make sure, I wasn't sure if cultural code is something that is clear. So that's it. I'm out of the picture. Okay.
Oh, well, that's okay. I think I have a sense of that, although I appreciate the, kind of the difference perhaps in phrases. So I think that one thing that struck me when I began attending the ROCOR Cathedral in Chicago, which I would only attend occasionally because I was actually living in a different part of the state, but my parents were living near there, so I would go there. But one thing that struck me that I think relates to your question is seriousness about faith, about liturgy. I remember a talk I heard, I think there's an audio version of this by Father Seraphim Rose, where he talked about the American instinct for fun, that everything's about fun in American life. And he said other cultures look at this and think that we're insane, and they're right. So I say that as I'm laughing here. But I think that seriousness about faith and liturgics was very important to me in a positive way, and I think that was reflective of a Russian faith culture. I know that at the time that I was visiting Orthodox services early in my journey to Orthodoxy, a friend brought me to one of the mega churches, one of the Protestant mega churches, Willow Creek Church outside of Chicago, which is sort of a progenitor of this type of Protestant church. We have a couple smaller versions in our area of this, but where they have electrical music and big screens, and they have coffee bars and all sorts of things. I remember we took my son to visit one of those churches that had a Christian school, a Protestant school, because we were thinking, well, maybe he might go there, but he said, I can't go there. This isn't like a church to me. He said, it's like a shopping mall. And so I think he had already become a bit Russian Orthodox in his views, even as a child at that point. So I think that seriousness struck me in a positive way. I think that's also something that can be a little hard for Americans to understand. But I think in terms of speaking about cultural code, when I was growing up and 100 years ago, there was a much stronger, what I would call Anglo-American culture in America, and for good and bad. I mean, there were bad things about that. There arguably were some good things about it. But I think today in the United States, increasingly, the culture is so fragmented that I think that's a problem. I mean, it's, there's some good things about that, but also it poses a problem for evangelism, because what kind of cultural code among the natives here, so to speak, are we aiming at when we're evangelizing versus, say, something like the Russian cultural code that you were speaking of, for the Russian church. So I think that here in central Pennsylvania, in this Appalachian region, there is a kind of regional culture. So we have members who have come in with their families. So they come in with their social networks into Orthodoxy. A mission near here, which is an OCA mission, but some of us came from that into ROCOR. The pastor came over from the Lutheran church, which is pretty dominant in this area. And he brought some of his parishioners with him, that whole network. And we have another Lutheran pastor whom I think Father Andre has encountered, Ricky Phillips, who comes to our mission to Vespers regularly. He comes to our Bible study. He got a blessing to be in the pastoral school. He considers himself on a long-term transition into Orthodoxy, but he's still on a road. It's a journey for him. But I think that there are people who come in and they are attracted to Orthodox teachings. I think, to use Ricky as an example, I hope he doesn't mind, he may see this on YouTube, but I'll say that he has concerns, about the state of the Lutheran Church in the United States, particularly the more liberal wing that his parishes are part of, although his parishes are in the country and more conservative. So I think this gets back to what we said were the kind of pros and cons of these kinds of cultural issues. There are definite problems, but there are also reasons why people have concerns about seeing historic religious denominations in the United States, in their view, go contrary to biblical teachings and the historical teachings of those denominations. And so that makes them wonder, well, what's the real basis for my sense of the Christian church here? And then that sends them to look into older forms of Christianity and to the Orthodox Church in some cases as well. So I think that's the kind of positive side of that, which can have its negative side too in America today. So that was a long-winded answer. I'm not sure if that addressed your whole question, but please follow up.
I'm sorry for taking a little bit more of the time of other students as well.
That's fine. Go ahead.
The third part of my question was: is there something that you observe in the Russian in ROCOR culture, which is still for you hard to not assimilate, but rather something that it's hard to maybe understand, or you know what I mean?
Right. I do. So I think Donald Sheehan he taught at Dartmouth, and he was an American convert to Orthodoxy, and I think in the OCA, and he reposed several years ago, but he wrote a lot about Dostoevsky. He wrote a beautiful essay on Dostoevsky, and he said Dostoevsky's major novels, in his view, he summed it up in a little formula that I use with my students. He said that the message is about self-emptying rather than self-assertion. So I think when you go from American culture, and I talked about, there are these biblical bases to American culture. There is in Scots, Irish, Appalachian American culture, there's a kind of, this gets very technical, but I think there's a kind of Jacobitism versus Jacobinism. These are historical terms from England, but Jacobitism was sort of a looking to the lost monarchy, you know, in the case of like the Constitution and things about America, which has a little bit of parallel to, you know, ROCOR situation. But, you know, that's a whole nother conversation. And those are some of my strange ideas. But I think that there's an emphasis in American culture on self-assertion, which is so prevalent that it's really different from the Russian church and the Russian culture related to the Russian church, in my view. And so that's maybe the biggest challenge that I still have. Yeah.
No, that's totally that's outstanding. I will tell you that's the greatest things I learned from today's meeting with you. What you said, and just to take up on this, and I'm not steering away from Ivan's question that Russia, at least the Soviet Union of my time, was still a communal society, where it was okay to ask like a kid on the street, why you are not in school this morning, and so. But whereas America, which has a lot of advantages, is very individualistic society. And you mentioned loneliness, and loneliness can be a side product. So nobody wants to be interfered. Nobody wants to be bothered. Everyone wants to have his personal space. It's understandable, but also it comes with a price tag. Back to you, Ivan. I am not taking things from you, so we still have time for everyone to talk. So therefore, if you need some more clarification, please speak up, Ivan.
Okay. I would take the guilt upon me for asking another question, if it's possible. What I think my classmates would really appreciate it. So, Father, we are graduating students this year. We are first year in the seminary. So, just from your general experience, what would be an advice for a student that is going into the world and for maybe for a possible future priesthood here in United States and both in North America and Canada? Well, just in like Western American society and world.
Right. Well, that's a very good question. It's probably beyond me and my poor spiritual state and still learning as I am about Orthodoxy, but I'll try to answer that at least partly. And I think American culture has been a little bit, and I'll speak specifically of American culture. You were saying in the world, but you know, I'll just kind of bring it back here if that's okay. I think American culture has a sort of bipolar aspect. It is very self-assertive, but it also has this strong background in many places, like the region that I'm in, where our mission is, where there's a lot of roots in, for lack of a better term, I would call biblical culture, right? So it's an odd thing that the freedom of expression that Father Andre talked about also encouraged a kind of religious culture that was more active, even in a heretical way, variety of ways, than in many other Western countries over time. And that's changing. I fear that America's accelerating into a very secularist mode, and it may turn into something pretty awful, you know, in the next generation or two. We'll see. Hopefully not, God forbid. But I think that one thing is just to think about if you're going to be in America as a Russian clergy, Russian church clergy, think about trying to connect with those aspects of interest in the Bible and biblical studies, as well as, you know, first of all, offering the example of a Christian life. That's the most important. And the liturgy as a center of community to people in traditional Christianity, and offering the salvation of our Lord in the gospel in that way. But also thinking about maybe approaches to people through Bible studies and communicating with them on some level biblical study, because on a very small scale and an unworthy and not wholly successful way at all. I find, for example, when I'm teaching college students at a secular university, when I'm teaching the Bible as literature, there is such a low level of biblical literacy, but there is a high interest and a thirst for knowing about it. And I think that comes from parents or grandparents, some sense of knowledge that, well, this is something I should know, but I just don't. And I think Orthodoxy offers so many wonderful insights into biblical tradition. We have such a rich, for lack of a better word, I'll say such a rich intellectual tradition in Orthodoxy. By that, I mean something larger than just the academic, because it's experiential, but also, like all the writings of the Church Fathers, the 19th century Russian commentators, like Saint Theophan the Recluse and so forth, and then 20th century Russian philosophers. I think Father Andre may remember. I really have gotten to love S.L. Frank as a Russian exile philosopher from the 20th century. There's so many wonderful insights from Russian Orthodoxy that relate to the Bible. S.L. Frank talked about strange love, and he talked about strange love as a love of a homeland that no longer exists. And that can apply to Russia in some sense for people no longer in Russia, but it also can apply very much to just the state of human beings, the condition of human beings, particularly in the modern world, that we long for paradise and yet, we're in exile. And when the royal doors open in the liturgy, we have that sense of paradise coming forth and touching us. And so I to get back to your question, I would say just kind of in America in particular, we could do more, I think, with biblical study and outreach and, thinking about, I don't know exactly how to do that. We have a community Bible study in our mission. I think it often is mainly our members or regular visitors who do show up, but I think we could do a little bit more with that and some other ways. So anyway, so that's a very partial answer to your good question.
Thank you very much. I think it's very important and opening eyes. Thank you very much.
Yes, S.L. Frank, who very interesting life. He had converted from Judaism to Orthodoxy before the Revolution, and was part of the Vaki collection, the Landmarks collection, writing about possibilities for a non-Marxist kind of future for Russia as a society. But one of the things that he wrote about was Sobornost as a kind of sense of hidden spiritual unity that involves that self-emptying rather than self-assertion. And that's one of the things that I like very much about his writings. So sometimes he's called an existentialist Christian or a Christian existentialist like Dostoevsky. And I think that kind of thought has a lot of appeal to intellectuals in the West to a good extent. There's something about that edginess. Dostoevsky in the 19th century, Frank in the 20th century, but there's a sense of, in some Russian thinkers, there's sort of a sense of the abyss of nihilism, and then how Christian faith can pull us back from that. But there's sort of a facing into the abyss that I think registers with some, Western people who are intellectuals or interested in deeper thinking about things, at least on an academic level. So, and that's another way to reach out to people, I think, too. So,
thank you. Any other feedback from our class?
I think Yvonne took some of our questions.
Yeah,
He was reading our minds.
that's what
Reading our minds.
that's what Ivan does, right? Yeah.
One thing, and Seraphim, if you have questions, please, ask away. But one thing I was going to mention, because this is a history class, was like about 100 years ago, I was an undergraduate history major. And my lead professor was a professor of American history called Gordon Wood, who's still alive. And Gordon Wood is identified often with a sort of theory of history about cultural paradigms and paradigm shifts. So he would say that, for example, the American Revolution was a kind of paradigm shift, a shift in a sort of framework to a sort of model of a republic, that affected the culture as a whole. But, and partly he based that view on Thomas Kuhn's work in Science, the History of Science, where Thomas Kuhn, as you may know, talked about the shift of paradigms in science and how those paradigms reflect cultural beliefs to some extent. So to some extent, science is objective, but to some extent it reflects cultural frameworks as well, and those can shift. And so when I was thinking about today's class, I was also thinking about how could we think about cultural paradigms. This has come up in the questions and in the discussion, I think. But, what is there that overlaps between cultural paradigms between America and Russia? What is there that's different? How can that affect issues of evangelism? And of course, beyond all that is the experience of orthodoxy as a Orthodox Christianity as a almost a kind of empirical experience of of the faith and the spiritual, which to some extent overrides those and transforms those cultural paradigms. But at the same time, when you're thinking about evangelism and outreach, how do you work within different cultures to reach people? I spoke about early Ireland before. I spoke about the fragmentation of American culture today, which I think is a sort of added challenge, but opportunity perhaps as well for evangelism. And I don't think I have answers for this, but I'm just, raising this as something as, you all, hopefully God willing, will be continuing in work as clergy in the future and in mission work and evangelism, perhaps in North America, perhaps elsewhere. But how do we think of that sort of overlap between cultural models where we can reach out to people, just as the Apostle Paul used his experience and knowledge of both Jewish culture and Greek culture to help, reach out to people with Christianity. How can we do that from the standpoint of the Russian church and Russian tradition in relation to a country like America?
So, Father Paul, I would like to thank you dearly. So I will have to process some of the thoughts that you planted. I mean it, like last thing about St. Paul is very powerful. His experience of being bicultural, that's something, this is definitely my takeaway from this. So unless you gentlemen have questions, I would like to conclude this class because students are having a heavy overdose of me this week. So we will be having another class with them at 11. So I would rather give them some time away from me before we resume again. And I just would like to let you know that I'm very, very grateful to you, Father and Brother Deacon, for your sacrifice of being here with us this morning.
Well, thank you so much again for all that you do, Father Andre, for the church and for scholarship and in the academic world as well, and the two overlapping. And thank you to the students here for all you're doing and wanting to serve the church. And I hope to be up at Holy Trinity maybe this summer. You know, I guess COVID restrictions will probably be better and so forth. But it's such a wonderful center. It's always a blessing to visit there, you know, both the seminary and the monastery and the church, of course. And it's really such important work. I mean, all that you all are doing up there is just of inestimable value to Orthodoxy in America. So thank you all. Glory to God.
Thank you for your support, and please let me know when you are in the area, so we will meet up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father.
Thank
Really
you very
Thank you,
much, Father.
Father. It was fantastic. Yeah. Thank you.
Right,
Thank
right.
you.
So let us pray. I will ask Seraphim to do this. Okay, Seraphim, are you feeling okay to sing a prayer for us? Shine or shine.
Yep, I can do that.
Are you strong enough? Okay.
Shine, shine, O New Jerusalem, for the glory of the Lord has arisen upon thee. Dance now and exalt, O Zion, and exalt, O pure Theotokos, in the rising of him whom thou didst bear.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you soon.